Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, authors, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Norman Ohler. Norman is an award-winning German novelist, screenwriter, journalist, and New York Times best-selling author. Norman is best known for his book Blitzed, which has been published in over 30 languages and explores the widespread use of drugs in Nazi Germany, what role methamphetamines played in the military history of World War II, and for uncovering that German military and political leadership, including and especially Adolf Hitler, used psychoactive drugs during the war. Norman has also written about how Nazi experiments into psychedelics covertly influenced CIA research and birthed the CIA's notorious brainwashing and psychological torture program during the 1950s and 60s, known as MK Ultra. Although criticized, judged, and scoffed at by many, Norman has been undeterred in his research and approach to provide a historically proven side of the truth that outside of his research may have never been told. So, Norman, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Sure. Happy to be on your show and talk about some controversial things.
I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Like a short autobiography in a nutshell. I don't know. I wanted to be a professional tennis player, but I wasn't good enough. I realized this as a teenager. And my other interest was literature, so I focused on writing. Because I knew I could never win Wimbledon, but I thought maybe I could win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Because you can actually do it, it's possible if you're a good writer. But Wimbledon or the US Open was just impossible. So I became a writer. I kind of just made it up in my mind that I would be a writer, and I just kind of went with it, even at times when my father said I should get a normal job. I never gave up. Now I've been writing when my first book came out in 1996. I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, it's this. Let's see it here, actually. It's a detective story set in New York. I was living in New York at the time. It's the first, actually, I published it online, and it was the first hypertext or internet novel, I think, in the world of literature. Like, I had the idea to create a clickable map. So I programmed this clickable map. And then when you click on a certain part of this map of Manhattan, you enter the story on a different, each reader basically has a different path through the novel. That was my idea for the first book. So I always, for me, literature is always an experiment. So I'm not like a historian or a nonfiction writer. I'm just a writer. Basically I'm a novelist. But also as a novelist, I can write nonfiction books, and I just don't invent things and just do proper research. But the writing style is still like every project has a different writing style. So every book is an interesting journey. Actually, today my 8th book was published in Germany, The Magic Mountain, that's Zauberberg. And again, this is a very different book. This is about a skiing vacation I did with my daughter in Switzerland, and it turns into a reflection, kind of what world do we live in. So I'm just a writer, and the Nazis were also kind of interesting to me because I'm German, so I'm kind of it's kind of my home ground, to talk about the German history, and the Nazi era obviously is the most interesting. And I found out that drugs played a huge role during that time, which no one had really written about before. So that's why this book became very popular and was also translated into many languages. but it's not better than the other books or worse. All the 8 books are great books. And some become very known because they're about Nazis and drugs. I mean, it's a juicy topic. But for me, the second one not the second one, sorry, the 7th one about LSD, which I wanted to call LSD for Mom because it came out of the urge to help my mother against her dementia with LSD, because I had found in clinical studies that LSD in doses can actually help with dementia, just like it can help with depression and PTSD. Also, dementia is something that seems to improve or get less if you take psychedelics. So that book is very dear to me. That's the new one that's out in the US, Tripped, as it is called in the US. And probably this is the one we really want to be talking about today. Is that correct?
Well, I wanted to talk about all of them, but for sure, Tripped, and Blitzed, I believe, are, I think, as you mentioned, some of the juiciest for maybe us who don't know a lot about the Nazis and the history of the war.
I have one more book about the Nazi era. It's called The Bohemians, that's the American title. It's out in the US. And The Bohemians has nothing to do with drugs. It just has to do with a group of young people who lived in Berlin during the 30s and 40s, who didn't like the dictatorship, and who still, like, it was a network of friends, and they became a resistance group, but they didn't really want to. It just happened because they didn't, they just continued to live their free lives, and that's so I think if you're really interested in the Nazi era, The Bohemians is the best read because it really gives you an idea of how life was in Berlin during that time. It's also a nonfiction book. It's based on the largest resistance network against Hitler, which it really was. It was a resistance network, but it's basically just a fascinating web of stories. So that is what I recommend, actually, with The Bohemians.
I see. Well, before we jump into all of that and really take a deep dive into it, I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to really get to know you a little bit more. And then we can talk about Hitler, LSD, and mental health, since that's the premise of the show. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's safe to say that Germany has a very complex history mixed with some dark, troubling times. In your opinion, what is it like for Germans who may still have ties to the darkness of the past of Germany that are still living today?
May you say that again? What? I didn't understand it.
What is it like for Germans who may still have ties to the darkness of the past that are still living today?
I mean, everyone has ties to the past because everyone has a family, and every family went back to that time, So there's nothing. I mean, there's no, like, Germans who have a tie to the past, others don't, But I also don't think. I mean, Germany is just unique in the type of crime it committed, which was the Holocaust, not only against the Jews but also against so-called gypsies, Sinti and Roma. They also, in a way, did not a genocide, but they did mass murder against homosexuals, communists. So, I mean, and they did it in a way that's really unique with the concentration camps and the death camps, which is so outrageous that, let's just call it the worst crimes that were ever committed by mankind. And I wouldn't disagree with that. But let's just keep in mind that it's not only Germany that has a dark past. Maybe we have the darkest, but basically every major country that's not part of our glorious Western hemisphere, including the United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium, you name it, has a terrible past because we're all colonializing nations. and we inflicted so much suffering on the rest of the world and still profit from that, from those horrific actions. So I think in general it's interesting, to be very critical of where you come from. As a German, it's kind of I've I have a lot of fun with drugs and Hitler because it's such a light way of looking at this. I think Blitzed, for example, is a very funny book, even though it's very serious, and nothing in it is a joke. It's not a joke. How Hitler degenerates under opioids and how the German army marches under meth. But it is, I find it highly entertaining somehow. So we Germans, we are very lucky with our terrible past. We have a very entertaining, horrible past. While the Americans, I don't know. I mean, Tarantino does movies on the slave situation with, what's the name of that movie? Does it come to your mind?
No, I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
It's a great movie though. I don't know what I'm saying. You can interrupt me and ask those questions.
No, I mean, I agree with you that every country or a good majority of countries have a dark past. I think because of what happened in Germany and in concentration camps, and maybe people not knowing the full history of it, it's looked at differently. Like it's, so much worse than other countries who may have had atrocities that weren't brought to the light as much.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add to this. But
What was it like? Go ahead. I was gonna say, what was it like for you growing up in Germany?
I always kind of hated it because I thought it was provincial. I grew up in West Germany in a small town. The only good thing about it was that it was occupied by the Americans. So we had a US air base and also an army base, which was good, I thought, because it's at least a little bit, glamorous to have, some, like in our tennis club, there was a cool Air Force pilot who became my friend. So, but I was very much against the American policies, to be honest. I was more of a leftist. And that was when Reagan was president. So for me, that was like evil. I thought the Soviet Union was much better than the United States. I mean, that's an exaggeration, of course, but I was not really a fan of nuclear weapons being driven through our hometown and poison gas was stored there. And I was kind of anti-American, but also pro-American because also I liked American culture. So I was anti-German because of the Holocaust. I was, not happy that my grandfather wasn't in the resistance, but was like working for the railway and like being part of the system. So I was always very much against fascism and racism. So I didn't feel so well in Germany because it's kind of fascist and racist, But it's still okay. I had a very safe upbringing. I'm white, so I'm fine. I'm a white male. I enjoy the privileges of the, white supremacist capitalist patriarchic system that we call Western democracies. So I have a good life in Germany, but only if I close my eyes.
Mm. Wow, that part had a little bit of depth to it. You mentioned that
I don't want to be so dramatic, but I think I'm also shocked by the state of the world, by the war that's going on and the West supporting the war. I think it's horrible.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned that your grandfather worked for the railway. Like, was there much choice for older Germans back then? Like, if they didn't support the government, if they were to speak out, would they, like, be ostracized? Would they lose their employment, be jailed, or anything like that? Could your grandfather have like fought back or took a stand?
Well, yeah, I became interested in that question. That's why I wrote the Bohemians, because that's about people. Actually started Bohemians with the scene with my grandfather, and then explaining that he never went against the grain. And then I tell the story of over 100 people in Berlin who basically risk their life. So you have to risk your life, basically. If you don't want to risk your life, you have to confirm and do, what the parties or what everyone else does, or you could flee. Like Thomas Mann, my writer colleague, he just left, which is, he lost his property and stuff. But he just started a new life in Pacific Palisades, Los Angeles. So he was fine. But, my grandfather, maybe he couldn't have left, maybe he didn't have the financial means. But he was a Nazi, like from his mindset, like he didn't like the Jews. And he was like a right-wing racist guy. So he didn't think of leaving, He was not so active. He was just like party member and then working his job at the railway. He was like an engineer for the railway. So he knew about the transports of Jews to the camps. He told me about that once. I put that in the preface of the Bohemians. So, yeah, I mean, my other grandfather, he was also in the Nazi party. But I never met him. He died too early. So, but he was the father of my father. And my father said he wasn't really a Nazi. He was just a member of the party. I mean, he was like 18, 19. Everyone says Hitler's great. I mean, you have to be kind of intelligent to really see that it's wrong. If you're just a normal person, I guess you just follow everyone. So he followed everyone, and he was wounded by the Russians first in the war, and then by the Americans, and the Americans took him prisoner of war, and he was in Huntsville, Texas for like a year or 1.5 years as a prisoner of war. He always said that was his best time in the war, when he was a POW in Huntsville, Texas. So, I mean, it's rough, when you're like 18, 19 and Hitler's chancellor and there's like a world war, like you're fighting a war. You get drafted. You can't really say, I'm not doing it. I mean, if you do, they, put you in a concentration camp, or you have to be very smart about it. Like the characters I write about the Bohemians, they managed to get away with it for quite a long time. But it was a very suspenseful life that they had to live.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, I know even today, like if you want to oppose systems of power, there's always consequences and punishment, and we've progressed a lot more since those times. So I can only imagine what it could have been like to, stand up against the Nazis or Hitler.
We have demonstrations right now against the war in Gaza, and in our laws, it's totally legal to go out on the street and say your opinion. And it doesn't matter what your opinion is for. Is it for this or that, or against this or that? It's your right. But these demonstrations of people who show their solidarity with Palestine have been brutally stopped and interfered with by the Berlin police. And this has been very, very brutal, and the media doesn't really write about it because they're like on the side of these of this, and we're still, a democracy, but it's already like you wear a Palestinian scarf maybe in your car when I drive to school to pick up my son. I used to do that because I lived in Palestine for some time. For me, it was always normal. But now if you do that, maybe it's dangerous. So it's not that dangerous. I mean, it is, just imagine how it was during, the Third Reich, how tense that situation is. But we're not that far away from it. I mean, all of our societies are moving towards the right, are moving towards more state control, mind control, which is what I'm writing about in Tripped. and that's quite. I guess it's scary. I mean, in a way. I mean, it's also interesting to watch it how society changes. And again, since I'm so privileged, I don't really think anything will happen to me, even though I can't rule it out. But I have the means to just leave and live in Thailand or something. If Germany really becomes like a fascist country again, I just leave. But many people who are in similar situations than me, maybe not in Germany, but maybe in Palestine or maybe in some other country or territory, maybe they don't have a choice and they can't leave and they get, killed and whatever. So, I mean, fascism is everywhere, basically. So I'm writing about very contemporary things when I write about fascism, It's not about the past, it's about our world now.
Yeah. I heard you on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I was floored by literally almost everything I heard. And the first thing I thought was, man, like, history is most times not what happened, but what we're told to believe. And it just reinforced to me how important it is to fact check everything and to not just blindly believe what we're spoon fed to believe is the truth. Because if you do that, like you said, the news doesn't report these things. We see what they want us to see, or we're told what we should believe, even though it may not always be the actual truth.
I mean, it's a tricky thing because also you shouldn't believe what I'm saying and you shouldn't believe what I'm writing. It's just, but then again, what do you believe in? Or who do you believe? Maybe my books are successful because people somehow believe in them because I make it I make it very open how I come to my findings because I write how I go to the archives. Still, that could be deceiving. I could pretend that I'm going to the archives and there I really find the truth, and it's actually maybe not the truth. But I believe in it. It comes closer to the truth if you see actual documents and if you just kind of mimic or repeat what other people have said or read or have written.
Sure.
So, but it is a tricky thing. What is the truth? What really happened in the past? What's really happening right now on the planet? It's hard to figure it out. And yeah, maybe we don't have. I mean, we don't have to know everything. The only problem is if we believe things that are not true. Then it's a problem. So yeah, we have to somehow train ourselves to become perceptive and sensitive to our surroundings. And this is where I think the psychedelics come into play because they make you smarter in a way that they make your senses sharper. That's why I think they also stand at the beginning of humanity because they sharpened our senses when we were living in Africa and eating that mushroom or that leaf would increase your eyesight and you could hunt better. And then it was not only the perceptions that got sharper, it was also the thinking that changed and the abstract thinking that came. So I think psychedelics are very much needed today in order to make sense of the world.
You mentioned that you have seen a lot of documents in your research, but you also say that you're not a historian.
Right.
But then you've also switched it up to nonfiction, like when you wrote Blitzed. And
Yeah.
I believe it's the unadulterated truth about history, especially if you
Yeah.
can find documents in the archives and so on and so forth.
Right.
Was there a specific moment when you got involved in studying about drugs and their historical impact, especially associated with Nazi Germany?
You mean when did it start or how did it start?
Right.
Uh, it started with a friend who told me that the Nazis used a lot of drugs because he found old tablets, pills from that time and took them, and they contained methamphetamine, and he had a methamphetamine high with 60-year-old German pills. And then I researched a little bit. He told me the brand name, and I found that one guy had written, a medicine historian had written an article on methamphetamine and that it was also used by the German army. And the article wasn't so long, but it was quite interesting. So I met him, and then he told me where to look in the military archive for records relating to the meth use of the German army. And so that's kind of how it started. And then I became interested in archives as places to find things. But it's not so easy, but it's possible to find things actually. And they're all open, so they're kind of fascinating. They're really democratic institutions, unless, some papers are not available. Like Moscow had opened its archives right when Gorbachev and Yeltsin were the leaders of the Soviet Union and then of Russia, and then when Putin became president, the archives were closed again. So an authoritarian system always closes the archives because they don't want people to know the truth. They want people to believe in the fiction that's created by the government. So, since I call our societies, United States and Germany, already fascist, which I think they are, they're also still democratic because they still have open archives. And that's really valuable, and that gives us a chance. Also, the America has like the Freedom of Information Act, like those things like this are really important actually for a democracy. And so if your new president tries to eradicate that, you should kind of go on the streets and protest.
I don't know how many people would be willing to do that, especially if there's those consequences like we spoke about. You said that your friend found 60-year-old pills.
Yeah.
But then there was also documentation to validate that those pills were quite possibly what was being taken by the military.
Yeah. I mean, the pills are called Pervitin. It's the brand name, and the records show exactly how many Pervitin pills were ordered by the army. I mean, there's hundreds of pages on Pervitin research by the German army, and it's all connected to a professor who did this research because he was responsible for performance enhancement of the army. So it's quite well documented. You can read it all in Blitzed.
So something else that you speak about openly is that Hitler was on drugs. Now, were you able to find proof of this in the archives? Like, how do you substantiate that?
Um, I had read online that he had a weird doctor called Theo Morel. He was like his personal physician, and he's mentioned quite a lot, but no one goes into detail. There's always like the weird Dr. Morel was around Hitler again all the time, basically. So I looked up online which archive has the Morel papers, or if there are such things as the Morel papers, because of that you can give everything that belongs to you, all your writing, all your letters. Like at the time, people were still writing letters and diaries and everything you write. And like he was a doctor, so all his patient cards and all his notebooks and all of that is kept actually in the Federal Archive of Germany. They keep all of the papers of quite a lot of people, mostly people that are in the public eye, but also some, unknown people. Like you could donate all of your papers to the archive and maybe they will take them, or maybe they would say, no, we don't, no one cares about your papers. If I would do it, no, I'm a writer. I could even sell my papers. Like known writers, then they sell their, I don't know how it's called in English. In German, it's Nachlass, like their estate, like their. so Morel, actually, his was all there, so I could read it, and no one had really looked at it, because at the archives you also see like when was it looked at the last time, and the Morel papers were only looked at very few times in the last like 60 years, which is kind of weird that no one was interested in this guy, because he's very interesting. Because he writes a lot about Hitler. He was with Hitler every day, and reading his papers, I knew that the book would be a success because they were so interesting. And I mean, I'm not so interested in Hitler. I mean, it's very interesting, obviously, but I'm not like a Hitler fanatic or something, or Hitler. But still, reading how Morel, like what he puts in the syringe, because he gave Hitler injections every day. You can see that from his doctor's, notes. It's like every day is written down, and like, so it's quite interesting, because he also writes down what Hitler says and decisions that he has to take, and then he takes an opioid intravenously, and he has different ideas all of a sudden how the war should continue, and so I could write the true story in a way of Hitler, a story that no one's ever written before.
Sure.
He's the most examined man in history, so it was quite a feat. That's why the book's very famous. It's very good. Really.
You've also written about Nazi.
Lucky, that this guy wrote all this stuff down, and also I was lucky that no one had looked at this before. It's a lot of luck. This book was very lucky for me.
I think it's pretty wild that this information is out there and hardly anybody's looking at it.
It's very strange.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be very interesting, for example, to look at the medical records of JFK. But like that is probably not available because of the assassination. I mean, it would be interesting to figure out when it will become available, actually.
So my first thought about that is if there was something in his medical record that could show that maybe he was doing something that could have changed his thought pattern, and that thought pattern could have led to him, I guess, quote unquote, being out of line, and then being out of line could have led to his death. Like, I don't know that is necessarily something that would the United States would want the American people to have access to.
Yeah, the whole JFK thing is very weird. Because how can you not find out what happened on that day? It's very strange. But I'm not a JFK expert because I haven't really looked at it. But it's an interesting subject for sure.
I mean, even as an American and someone who can look at JFK's assassination and maybe have some question marks, like there's so many dead ends and there's so many different stories that you kind of just give up. And I don't know if that is purposeful or not, but if there were some sort of, like doctor's records where we could look at, or something factual, we could look at documentation, that would probably change the game.
Yeah, we have no documents on the JFK assassination. We just have stories. It's not enough. Right. We need proof.
Mm-hmm. You've also written about Nazi experiments into psychedelics. How did Nazis use psychedelics, and what was the purpose that you found?
They were interested in finding a truth drug, and they had already experimented with mescaline in the concentration camp of Dachau. But mescaline is hard to make, synthetic mescaline. And natural mescaline has a very bitter taste. From cacti, you can get it. So it's kind of hard. It's not really ideal for the SS or for the Gestapo or for any intelligence service. Because the idea of the truth drug is that you give someone something without that person knowing that he or she received something, and then consciousness changes and you become like a puppet, in the hands of the guy, usually a guy, I would say, who gives you the drug. That's the idea of the truth drug. So LSD was kind of a good candidate for it. And one of the leading German biochemists, he knew about LSD, which had been invented in 1943 by a Swiss chemist in Basel, Switzerland. And his boss, like the Swiss company's CEO, was best friends with the German Nazi biochemist. So I found a letter in the archives of this company, Sandoz. Now it's Novartis. A letter by the Nazi to the CEO saying that he received 0.5 gram of ergotamin tartrate, which is orgalmin tartrate, which is a precursor to LSD. It's like, if you have that, you can make LSD quite easily. If you don't have that, you can't make LSD. So he received it from the company in October 43. He acknowledged that he had it. So the Nazis kind of were the first users, in a way, I would say, of LSD. And that has certain consequences because when Germany was liberated from the Nazis by the Soviet Union coming from the east and the United States coming from the west, there was like a hunt for Nazi knowledge, because Nazi scientists were supposed to be top notch, which they were and were not. Germany was very good in science before it chased out the Jews, because a lot of German geniuses were Jews, so they were gone. So Germans without Jews were not so good in science, but still pretty good. So the Americans especially had great interest in benefiting from that knowledge. So they had special units attached to their military units made up of intelligence agents and soldiers, like a mix. And they arrested German scientists and interrogated them, basically, and then either sent them to the War Crime Tribunal in Nuremberg if they wouldn't cooperate, or they would give them cigarettes and chocolate and send them to the United States under Operation Paperclip. And basically, the Nazis could continue their careers and help the United States to become the dominant superpower, or at least the competing superpower against the Soviet Union. So one of the people that was interrogated was this biochemist, Richard Kuhn, who had known about the LSD program. And when he told the Americans about the LSD, the Americans became very interested in it, and then kind of continued the Nazi research with LSD for a potential truth drug on American soil. Especially actually using minorities in the United States to test, LSD. Without saying anything, basically conducting unethical, racist experiments. This was done by the CIA, then by Sidney Gottlieb. He was the director of the so-called MK-Ultra program, which was the main mind control program of the CIA. And one of the main features of this mind control program, which lasted for many years and involved a lot of people, were substances, psychoactive substances, mainly LSD, because LSD is really perfect for intelligence service, because you can't taste it, you can't smell it, you can't see it. You only need a few micrograms, and it works, in a way that you could really destabilize a person. If you give someone a high dosage of LSD, that person might think he or she's going insane. So you could kind of use it to disturb people. You cannot really use it as a truth drug, like the idea that you could create the Manchurian candidate, like you give someone LSD, and then that person's like in a trance, and then you tell that person, and now you have to go into that room and murder that person, and you will not remember when you come out. Like that kind of wet dream of the intelligence community of the 50s never worked out because it's just this naive concept. And LSD is just not the drug to do this, because it just acts very differently in the brain. And if you want, we can talk about how it actually acts in the brain. So that is the whole the failed LSD is basically the failed truth drug.
I wanted to circle back a bit and ask you about MK Ultra and I guess some of the quote unquote experiments that the CIA was doing using LSD. Do you have any knowledge of like any particular cities or areas where it was being used and how it was being used?
For example, they created what they called safe houses. They had one in New York City in the West Village and one in San Francisco on Telegraph Hill, where they equipped apartments with cameras and microphones, hidden, of course, and then lured people from the streets to come up there, like for private parties, where they could have like free drinks and stuff. And then the drinks would be spiked with LSD. Also in San Francisco, they additionally used prostitutes. This operation was called Midnight Climax. So prostitutes would bring their clients into the safe house in San Francisco and would dose them with LSD. And then their job was also to see if they can then, extract the secrets from someone and control the mind of someone. So anyone could actually, happen to be part of that experiment, and you wouldn't even know about it. You would think something's really weird happening. Maybe you would get paranoid or think you're going insane. Maybe think it would be a very unpleasant situation. And there are reports of people who, suffered from this afterwards, and only found out in the 70s when these activities became public in I think it was called the Church Committee at Congress, who was looking at the MK Ultra crimes that were committed. And then people came forward and said that they might have been a victim like 15 years ago. They remembered like something weird happened that night. So that's pretty out there.
I think the crazy part is that if you were to ask Americans today about MK Ultra and say to them, do you think the government would ever do anything like this? Or if you were to show them proof that MK Ultra was a thing and that it happened, a lot of people will say, no, I don't believe that. That never happened. That's not my government or things like that. But the fact that it is real and that it existed and there were these trials happening on just normal people, regular American citizens, building off of what the Nazis were using LSD for is pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, that Nazi link actually, that was never talked about before. I think that's like the thing that I uncovered in Trip, because I found these Nazi LSD experiments and then could link how the Americans found it through the Nazis. So, yeah, Americans who haven't read Trip wouldn't know about this anyhow. But I think there is a shift currently in the American public to very much be distrustful of the government, and that actually feeds into the Trump movement, basically. When the Democratic movement is kind of seen as that controlling, power, while the Trump people are kind of trying to dismantle that. Basically, that's how they try to. That's why this movement is very successful. Actually, I think in America, because a lot of people are actually realizing that yes, the government does do a lot of shit. So I think that's good to realize that, you know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my trip is a book about America, basically, a country where I have lived for many years, and that still keeps surprising me, actually, how crazy it really is.
Mm. I do agree with you that there is a lot of, or there are a lot of surprises that you could find if you really dig into the history of our country, and hardly anybody knows about them. So thank you for the work that you've done in your books and the things that you've shown. I wanted to ask you a question about LSD, a personal question. What are your feelings about LSD, and why do you think it has such a bad rap?
Um, I mean, why it has a bad reputation is um, because the anti-drug propaganda by the U.S. government was very effective. People actually believed it. People are actually scared of LSD.
Mm.
And I mean, when Sandoz developed LSD, they gave it to everyone in the company that wanted to use it. Like they created a room, um, a nice room, and you could take LSD there, and then you would write down how you felt, and everyone was very happy when they took LSD, and no one had a bad experience. And then they used it in Zurich in a hospital for depressed patients and psychotic patients, and the patients were cured. So LSD's had quite a good beginning, you know, had quite a good start, but then it kind of got under the wings of the CIA, basically. That wasn't good for LSD. Um, I mean, I, I trust one scientist. I mean, I trust, you know, many scientists, I guess, if I look at the papers and they make sense, you know. But one scientist I really like, Professor Vollenweider from the University of Zurich. He was one of the first neuroscientists that put people's brains into scanners under LSD and under psilocybin and under other drugs also. And he could see that the ego receives less energy while on LSD, and other parts of the brain become more active, and also, and that leads to an enhanced neuroplasticity, as it's called. And neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to be flexible and reconnect and kind of be a beautiful living organ that, you know, makes us humans, and is quite astonishing. LSD promotes that plasticity. So, and that's, you can see that, you know, when you do these scans. So the brain is very happy when it takes LSD. It's very good for the brain. So, I think it's quite strange that's why it's also good against dementia, because dementia is the opposite. It's like the brain becomes more and more rigid, and connections die off. And so whenever my mother takes LSD, you know, she becomes more red in the face, like she talks more animated, she understands more, she can read better. Um,
You had a really personal story with, or personal experience with your mother using LSD for her Alzheimer's. Can you
yeah,
share what happened with your mom when you gave her
well,
LSD?
yeah, I just did. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. Because my father has to give her the LSD, and he's a judge. He was used to be a judge, so he wanted to know the true story of LSD before he gives his wife LSD, an illegal drug. Um, so the book Trip kind of tells that story, why, the story that we talked about in this interview. So, yeah, my mother likes to take LSD. My father never notices anything. They take only microdoses, but that's good. It's not necessary to take so-called hero dose of LSD. You can, but you should start with a microdose and slowly take more, if you want. Um, so that's a different approach actually to using LSD. While in the 60s, everyone took a hero dose. Everyone was like totally tripping, but dancing around, naked. That can happen on LSD, but not necessarily. If you just take a microdose. It's like drinking a coffee or something that lasts for 4 hours. Normally, coffee lasts only for 1 hour and then it's gone. But a microdose of LSD lasts for 4 hours, so it's good. So no, LSD is good. It's good for everybody. Maybe not for everybody. We always have to say there's dangers. I have had LSD trips which were very strong, where I thought, my God, this is too strong. Then you can't control your thoughts anymore. So you have to. It's like you don't climb the highest mountain if you're unused. If you're not a good mountain climber, because the oxygen's too thin up there, you might die. First, you do a mountain that you can handle, and so you have to be responsible in what you're doing. And obviously, kids are not responsible yet; they don't know yet, so it should be illegal for underage people. But once you're 18, you should drive a car, drink alcohol. To not allow us to use LSD is kind of ridiculous. Doesn't make sense.
Especially if there's scientific research, like you said, that shows that it does increase
No, very much. It leads to more.
neuroplasticity. And yeah, I mean, if it's helping with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, all those things, even Alzheimer's.
Well, like with psilocybin, clinical studies have shown that statistically, when your brain's on psilocybin, it recalls more positive memories than your sober brain does. And if you're depressed, you recall more negative memories, and this recollection creates loops, ruminations. This is the depression, and psilocybin disturbs that. And because we all have experienced nice things and bad things, depressed people are, and they're not depressed because they experience more bad things. That can happen through trauma, etc. But again, also there, psilocybin and LSD can shift, your perspective, and it's actually a very American thing, to not always dig in the bad things, but to look at the bright side of life. So I think LSD and psilocybin are like prototypes of the American drug. And the free individual, of course, needs them or wants them or should have the right to use them. So that whole anti-drug thing is totally un-American, totally old school. It blocks the economy. It's bad for mental health. It's just any politician who still keeps up those rules of prohibition should be voted out of office. It's just harmful to the public to
I
not
agree.
legalize it.
I think it's sad that there are so many beneficial, natural substances with no side effects, if taken in moderation, that can heal and help. And those things are illegal, or we're told that um, we shouldn't use these things, or there's anti-drug policies about those things. But then you can take, any number or myriad of the drugs that drugs companies say are okay, even though they have a 20-minute dissertation about the side effects on their drug commercials.
Yeah, I mean, these CEOs should be imprisoned and not, poor people who take, LSD or something. It's really strange.
It
Also,
is.
very strange. Like a lot of legal medications are actually amphetamines. Like even methamphetamine type medications are legal in the United States, like Adderall. But on the other hand, amphetamine is illegal, even though it's legal when it's called Adderall or something. I mean, the whole thing is totally absurd. It doesn't. The whole drug law situation makes no sense whatsoever. The whole war on drugs is totally wrong. And the government has to acknowledge that. It has to apologize. It has to rehabilitate people who suffered under these rulings. A lot has to be done in that respect.
I agree. I think conversations like this, individuals such as yourself who write the way you write, and talk about things that will bring history to the light. Because if we don't know the past, we don't know where we're going. So another question I wanted to ask you, with all that you're currently doing, your books, your research, what is it that you want people to know most?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I think you really have to know most about yourself. You have to find yourself. And if literature can help with that, then I'm happy to contribute.
Last question for you. You could use your platform to educate anyone who may be struggling with their mental health and believe psychedelics are bad or unsafe. What would you say to them?
Um, People think that they're bad and unsafe. What would I say to them? Well, I would say to them that they're wrong. But no one says that anymore. So, I've never encountered. I mean, the times have really changed. Somehow people seem to realize that they're not bad and safe.
All right. Well, Norman, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, um, to talk about a lot of things like Hitler and Nazis and LSD. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and your expertise. If somebody wanted to look you up on social media or online, where can they find you?
Um, People shouldn't use social media at all, I think, but I use it also. And I'm on Instagram at Norman Ohler. And I think I even want to create a YouTube channel because I want to record funny videos of explaining drugs to the world. But it's not online yet. I think for the moment it's really best to buy my books, the 3 books that are out in America: Bohemians, Tripped, and Blitzed. Maybe Tripped. You should start with Tripped. Probably buy it in a local bookshop. They don't have it, they should order it for you. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I thank you for having me on your show, and I hope we speak again.
All right. Thank you, Norman. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do and for how you do it.
All right.